This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac. 28 minutes of stories for everyone about Ukrainian life. Nasha Kasha is heard on 16 campus and community radio stations from Newfoundland to British Columbia. Vitayu, my name is Stefan Andrusiak, and this is episode 180. The Merriam-Webster dictionary says that a crucible is a vessel. It's a container for melting metal or other substances that require a high degree of heat. It can also mean a severe test. Thirdly, a crucible is a place or a situation in which concentrated forces interact to cause or influence change or development. Ukrainians have constantly been undergoing changes, surviving, adapting, growing. In Ottawa, November 1st, 2019, delegates and community leaders from Halifax to Victoria convened at the 26th Triennial Congress of Ukrainian Canadians.
Добрий день.
In Canada's capital city, November's bleakness, rain, and wind were quickly dispelled. For these Canadians came to examine the data and to hear the ideas on how we can grow here, how we can help there, here and there. Ukrainians say Tut Itam. You're listening to Saskatchewan's band Tut Itam. In this Western Canadian polka, Tut Itam reminds us that there's work to be done. Say it with me. Tut Itam.
Цілий тиждень роблю, в п'ятницю я їду, в Саскатуні там я маю хату. Бо я є в місті, трохи віддихнувся, а перші вікна мушу малювати. Треба робити, треба все сплатити, а треба всю решту я маленький. Прийду лягати, трошки треба спати, по роботі мушу бути в час, щоб на мене не сварився бас.
Today on Nasha Kasha, we'll get to know the diaspora's leading voice, President of the Ukrainian World Congress, Paul Grod. But first, we'll get to know a demographer who has spent many a waking hour calculating our numbers, studying our groupings, and he has some ideas about our potential.
My name is Oleg Volovina. I am a demographer sociologist by profession. I have been retired for 15 years, but I'm actively engaged in two major research projects.
Dr. Volovina, could you take me back to your youth?
I was born in Ukraine, Western Ukraine, but we had to flee during the Second World War because my father was on the list of the Communist Party to be shot. So when the Red Army came back, we had to leave everything and flee, ended up in Austria.
How did he find himself on that list? What happened?
Well, the first time when the Russians came to Western Ukraine before the Second World War, they were there for 2 years almost, he was called by the KGB to be interrogated a couple times. German forces advanced when they had to flee. They had the policy of shooting people that were on the list, and he was on that list.
What was he suspected of being?
He was working at the agricultural co-op, and he was helping with food to the insurgent army that was fighting on both fronts, German and communist.
So he was providing food for these fighters?
Food help, yeah. So he was on the list of suspects. So he had to hide. But when they were coming back, he knew if he stayed, he would be shot.
He fled with his family?
Yeah, the whole family fled during the Second World War to Czechoslovakia and then ended up in Austria. And after the war, we ended up in Argentina. My father's brother was living in Argentina. So I grew up in Argentina.
Do you speak Spanish?
Yeah, I went through the whole school system in Argentina.
Is that where you developed your love for mathematics?
In Argentina, we had a military coup in the late 60s. And they closed universities because they were the focus of resistance. So they closed university for 3 years. And I found out when I came to the United States, there was such a thing as called demography, the study of population. I got interested in that, and I got my degree in applied mathematics, specifically demography and statistics. I started teaching at University of Western Ontario. Then I came back to the United States, and I spent 20-some years doing international work in population.
You're married? Do you have a family?
Yeah, married, 2 children and 6 grandchildren. My wife's American.
So let's talk about what you know about how numbers in the Ukrainian context are changing.
In Canada, you have a certain history of migration. In Canada, you have the first wave that ended up in Western Canada, 100% rural, basically. You had whole villages, 100% Ukrainian, almost. So that's why you have been so successful in having a lot of political influence in Canada. In the United States, it was very different. There was no land available anymore that same time in the United States. So people came to the cities. Actually, they started working in coal mines in Pennsylvania. That was the first migration. Then they branched to other factories, other states. But the immigration was 100% urban, or almost 100%, and basically non-skilled workers. So the development of the community was very different compared to Canada. And for some reason, in the United States, the Ukrainian community has not developed the political influence that you have developed in Canada. They're more dispersed. And of course, the proportion of Ukrainians in the United States is much smaller because the population is 10 times bigger than in Canada. So although the numbers are similar, like around 1 million, but proportionally, Ukrainians are much stronger in Canada.
Let's go back to Canada. Can you give us a snapshot and talk about potential of Ukrainians hanging on to their heritage? Is that a fair question?
No, I think it is a fair question. I think the issue of the heritage has been strengthened by Ukraine's independence. It has been a vitamin. You see, although there's a very high proportion self-declared of mixed heritage, they claim to be Ukrainian. The great majority of the 1.4 million are of mixed heritage, not pure Ukrainian heritage, descendants of mixed marriages. But many of them declare that they're Ukrainian. And that by itself means something.
Because they're self-identifying.
Exactly. One important development, demographically speaking, is the dispersion from the traditional centers of settlement like Toronto or Edmonton to other places where there were no Ukrainians. So you see tremendous growth in British Columbia, and you see appearance of small cities with significant number of Ukrainians both in Ontario or in Alberta. You also see a very significant growth in the Atlantic provinces and the Northern Territories. And that presents opportunities for Ukrainian organizations of different kinds to expand their work.
You have people who self-identify even though they may be third, fourth generation, their parents are of different races, ethnic backgrounds, and somehow that Ukrainian thread goes through them and they feel good about saying, I'm Ukrainian, I'm part Ukrainian, I celebrate that, and I value my heritage. You talk about newcomers coming from Ukraine, but while people who are not fully ethnically Ukrainian are self-identifying in Canada, the people who are fully Ukrainian coming from Ukraine are saying, I don't really want a part of organized life. And that's the conundrum that the Ukrainian Canadian Congress finds itself in. The people who are coming here who speak perfect Ukrainian are kind of keeping to themselves and saying, I'm here because of my job and I want a better life, and who can fault them?
Actually, the answer is yes and no. A certain proportion of these people couldn't care less about Ukrainian community. As you say, they came here to get a job and have a better life than Ukraine. But quite a few of them did become integrated in the organized community. And they found jobs there, like teachers in Ridna Shkola, which there was a big need for that, or directors of choirs, or dance groups. So they have skills that are very useful for the community and give them a good job.
And a shot in the arm for that community.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what the proportion is in Canada, but in the United States, half of those immigrants are Russian-speaking, not Ukrainian-speaking. And in some communities, they were rejected because of that. But in some, they were accepted.
Because that's the spoken language under communist times in their families and in their schools and in their jobs in Ukraine.
They are the product of a policy of Russification and destruction of the Ukrainian language. So in some part of eastern Ukraine, you have generations that grew up in Russian schools and they'll be totally Russified. But many of them consider themselves Ukrainian. I know personally young men fighting in Donbass that don't understand Ukrainian, but they consider themselves Ukrainian patriots. Ukraine is their country, and they're fighting to defend the country and their family from the Russian invasion. There were decrees where Ukrainian was forbidden as a language. There was a time where priests were not allowed to preach in Ukrainian churches in Ukraine.
And even though it was USSR Union of Soviet socialist republics, you're saying that it wasn't a Soviet culture, it was a Russification.
It was an explicit statement by the government that eventually the Russian language should be universal for the whole Soviet Union, all the nations. Key point. Until Ukraine's independence, the Ukrainian diaspora considered themselves the true Ukraine. That was the policy, the conviction.
Because they were the crucible that took Ukraine and the values and the culture and the language as it stood before it was being overtaken, and they took it to a foreign land and they kept it. They're keeping it alive. Is that one?
Exactly. That's the point. But since Ukraine's independence, my position is that the diaspora lost its compass and still looking for a policy that is adequate to a new position of a diaspora with an independent mother country. It's a very different situation. Now there is an independent country called Ukraine. We are not the true Ukraine anymore. The true Ukraine is the country called Ukraine. Our role as citizens of the country we live on has become very different. Now our role is, on the one hand, to influence our governments vis-a-vis the politics of that country versus Ukraine, and the other is to inform our co-citizens about Ukraine and its culture, because most people don't know much about it. So the role of the diaspora has changed drastically, because in the first years everybody started traveling to Ukraine, collecting money to help, etc., and they forgot about ourselves.
So is there a course correction that can be made easily?
Absolutely. In order to be effective in this new role of the diaspora to help Ukraine, the diaspora has to become stronger in their own country. Only then they'll be more effective. And so we have to start investing in our institutions here and spend less money on Ukraine. In modern society, information is a key element for effective functioning. That's a general given. In the United States, the decision was made to create a center of research of Ukrainians in the United States that has been functioning for several years, and we are now producing data that is useful for the community. Well, Canada has tons of data, but so far has been very little exploited. And I think it's important for the community in Canada to realize the importance of starting working with that data as a tool for better decision making.
What is the official name of that data gathering organization in the U.S.?
Well, it's the Center for Demographic and Socioeconomic Research.
And it's associated with?
The Shevchenko Scientific Society in New York.
Oh, in New York City.
New York, yeah.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Nasha Kasha comes to you from CHRW 94.9 FM on the campus of Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. We're heard on CHMR 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland, on CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, on Local 107.3 FM in St. John, New Brunswick, on CJAS Radio 93.5 FM in Saint Augustine, Quebec, on CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, on CFMU 93.3 FM in Hamilton, on CKMS 102.7 FM in Kitchener-Waterloo, on CJAM 99.1 FM in Windsor and Detroit, on CKLU 96.7 FM in Sudbury, on CILU 102.7 FM in Thunder Bay, on 101.5 UMFM in Winnipeg, on CFMQ 98.1 FM in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, on CFBX 92.5 FM in Kamloops, and on CIVL 101.7 FM in Abbotsford, British Columbia.
Hi, I'm Pavlo Grod. I'm the president of the Ukrainian World Congress. I was born and raised in Toronto. My parents are from Ukraine. They're post-World War II displaced persons. During the Second World War, they were taken from Ukraine by the Germans, and they were essentially slave laborers on German farms. They were teenagers at that time with their families, and after the war, they were taken into these displaced persons camps that at that point then allowed to immigrate into different countries. And my parents chose Canada. I have two brothers, one who's since passed away. My wife, Adriana, was also born in Canada. Very similar history to my parents' history and her family. And we now have 4 great kids, Roman, Danilo, Larissa, and Elena. They're all active in the Ukrainian community, which is really wonderful for us. Most importantly, what was really fascinating is that this generation that came over after the Second World War, they were developers from the perspective of developing institutions that our community is today based on. The Ukrainian Cultural Center in Toronto on Christie Street. My parents were very much involved in raising money to build that because they wanted a place where their kids could grow up.
At which point in your youth did you feel that you would carry this forward?
I would say it's my mid-teens. Mid-teens, I was getting more involved in a leadership capacity with the Ukrainian Youth Association. I became a counselor. I started working with kids. And I started to recognize when I was put on the spot to actually try to teach young Ukrainian kids about what it is to be Ukrainian. I started to become more Ukrainian myself.
You didn't become a teacher professionally. You became a lawyer and then a business person.
When I graduated University of Toronto political science degree, at that point, Ukraine was recently independent. So this is 1994. And I had a phenomenal opportunity to go and work in Ukraine for a year for the Council of Advisors to the Parliament of Ukraine. And it gave me an opportunity to sort of see the world from a different perspective. And I think it got me motivated in terms of the things that I'm involved with today. I then went back and completed a law degree and an MBA. And so I worked as an investment banker. I worked as a lawyer for a major national law firm. And then later went on to start my own company called Rodan Energy, which I've been running for the last 16 years. I'm very proud that we're a leading North American energy management company.
What does that mean, energy management company?
So our company works with large energy users, manufacturers, commercial companies, institutional hospitals, universities, to help them better manage their power consumption. Part of it is called energy efficiency. Part of it is called demand-side management. So we essentially help them determine when best to use power and find ways that they can reduce power consumption for short periods of time, which makes a great impact on their energy bill. When is it best to avoid using power? Because again, you're talking about a steel company that they have an opportunity to stop rolling steel for a certain period of time, or stop grinding rocks to create cement for a short period of time. And by using how they use power, when they use power, they can dramatically reduce their cost of use of power.
I mean, how do you manage that, stay on top of that, and become a leader on the Ukrainian scene first, at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and now at the Ukrainian World Congress.
Whether you're effective in community life or effective in business life, you use similar skill sets in terms of how do you engage people, how do you motivate people. As you know, we've heard the age-old adage of, what's a real true leader, and that is getting people to do something because they want to do it. And the same applies whether it's community or in business. And so we've been successful in business because, number one, I've got a fantastic management team. We've got about 100 people working at Rodan Energy right now, and I like to identify people who are talented and to get involved in whether it's in a business life or a community life. You can't do everything yourself. At the end of the day, it's being able to organize and motivate and manage talented people, whether it's in business or community life.
So you identify people at home in your business. How did the Ukrainian communities around the world identify you to become the head of the Ukrainian World Congress, which you are today?
It starts from, where you're most impactful with your community. And I was very much in my early days of getting involved with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, I felt passionate about a number of issues. I was really disappointed on how Ukrainians were being viewed because of the supposed World War II war crimes. And that's what really got me involved initially, because I thought there was a real injustice here, that the Ukrainian community was being inappropriately vilified because of these allegations that they were Nazi war criminals.
Who was being vilified specifically?
Well, specifically, it was referencing those that fought for Ukraine's independence during the Second World War, that being the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and the 1st Galician Division, the Divizia Division, as it was called. I felt that was very, very unfair. And when there was a whole attempt to deport and denaturalize and deport Ukrainians during that period of time, I became more involved with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress in their efforts to try to provide and develop a principled policy approach to this issue, which I think at the end of the day, we were relatively successful. I also saw a huge injustice with the non-recognition of the First World War internment operations, and I got involved in that campaign. And
so you're taking these issues important to Ukrainians in Canada, and you're dealing with one government, the federal government, ostensibly. How do you translate that skill set into representing Ukrainians around the world in how many countries, and now dealing with Ukraine?
So the Ukrainian World Congress has been active. It was founded over 50 years ago, and it was founded by the leaders of Ukrainian communities around the world, primarily focused the bigger communities, the stronger communities, meaning the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia. And today, the Ukrainian World Congress brings together communities in 64 countries around the world, and it's something we continue to build. So how do we translate that? At the end of the day, many of the things that we do here in Canada, meaning that the Ukrainian Canadian Congress brings together communities around Canada with some 28 branches around the country. We help organize communities locally, provincially, and federally. The same principles apply on the global stage, where we try to organize communities in those countries, help them become more effective. And we have communities all over: Singapore, India, and then the traditional ones, your Australia, your Great Britains, but lots of new immigrants. And one of the key challenges for us is how do we engage them? How do we make sure that their needs are met, whether it's social services or education, whatever it may be.
Dr. Volovina, who is a demographer and a statistician, in an interview told me that after the Second World War, when your parents emigrated, Ukraine was an enslaved nation. The immigrants coming to the various diaspora, the various countries, took with them in a crucible, my word, not his, in a chasha, all the values, all religious freedom, and they became what Ukraine in their eyes should be. He's saying that we were very good at that, but maybe right now we are struggling to, in the face of a free Ukraine, to let go of that. Are we having a hard time letting go? And what is the role? You're the leader. What is the role? How do we play into that?
We are Ukrainians no matter where we live, much like the Jewish diaspora. They're Jewish whether they live in Israel or they live outside of Israel. We care for the future of Ukraine because really its security, its future, its existence, unfortunately, still today is in jeopardy. I remember listening to a talk given by Anne Applebaum a couple of years ago, where she compared that what the Ukrainians feared in Stalin today fear in Putin.
She's the journalist and author and historian who wrote Red Famine and other books about the Soviet Union in pre-war times and more recently.
And I think, and this is coming from somebody who's an observer, who's a journalist, who's an academic, who is not of Ukrainian heritage. And, it's interesting to sort of see that observation, which I fully agree with. And I think it's important that we, as the global Ukrainian community, that we all have a vested interest in the future of Ukraine and its success. And that's why the Ukrainian World Congress has 3 strategic priorities. Number 1 is to end Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, because it's not just aggression in Ukraine. We see that there is continuous human rights abuses against the Ukrainians living in Russia, living in the occupied territories, and even strategy of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, that they're deploying in Europe and other countries is significantly impacting Ukrainians, where they feel threatened in even those countries in Europe. So that's priority number 1. Priority number 2 is to help build a strong, independent Ukraine, a European Ukraine, with European values. And priority number 3 is to establish and to facilitate the development of strong Ukrainian communities around the world. We, as the Ukrainian World Congress, believe that we have an important role to play in Ukraine's future because of those 3 reasons. But we really rely, in terms of being able to fend off Russian aggression, we rely on the countries around the world that we live in. Having conscientious Ukrainians in those countries that are united, that are well organized, that are affluential and influential is critical. Prime Minister Trudeau doesn't wake up in the morning and say, what am I going to do to help Ukraine today? It's really up to us to work with him, his government, members of parliament, both sides of the legislature, to ensure that they are educated, that they're informed about what is happening in Ukraine and why it's important for them, for Canada, why it's in Canada's best interest to support an independent Ukraine and help Ukraine defend itself against Russia's aggression. Being born in the Ukrainian community, you are baptized in a Ukrainian church. You go to Ukrainian daycare, Ukrainian school, Ukrainian youth organizations, student organizations, professional business organizations, a plethora of various cultural organizations, right through to Ukrainian old age homes and Ukrainian cemeteries. It's really cool to be Ukrainian. When I meet with the Prime Minister of Canada, he refers to us as Ukrainian Canadians. And that's why I think this is the greatest country in the world to live in. And that's why we should be very proud of who we are. We have a very rich and dynamic and vibrant cultural heritage that we come from.
Thank you very much, Pavlo Grod.
My pleasure. Thank you, Stefan.
Earlier in the program, you heard Newfoundland's The Kubasonics with Harmony in the Family. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha comes from the Shevchenko Foundation. I'm your reporter Stefan Andrusiak. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.